the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
This is unbelievable. A brand new study just came out on near-death experiences, and it is quite shocking, and there is a pun intended in there, and you'll see why in just a minute. Near-death experiences are something that I just find people are so intrigued about. There's been so many books that have come out in recent years about people claiming to have gone to heaven and come back. What can they really prove to us about religion and the truth of one's faith? You might be surprised at this, but there's no shortage of people experiencing near-death phenomenon. This is an intriguing study that has come out in New York City, and CNN actually had an interesting piece about this. There's a case in particular that's mentioned in the article of this guy who was 80 years old. His name was Aubrey Osteen, and he had a heart attack in December of 2020. And the surgeons were just about to saw through his chest, saw through his ribcage so they could operate. And then all of a sudden, he's conscious. He says, quote, "Wait a minute here before y'all go any further. Give me some more anesthesia, you know? Well, it took me a minute to realize I wasn't in the same dimension they were in, so they couldn't hear me anyway," end of quote. So he then allegedly watched his body, and he sort of saw himself weaving through his own ribcage and starting to float above the operating table. The surgical team cracked his chest open, removed the heart, and began to repair the damage. And then he heard somebody say the word kidneys, kidneys. Both his kidneys had shut down at the same time. He said, quote, "I knew I was gone. And that's when I went to the next level," Osteen says. "When I got up there," he said, "I was in the presence of God, a powerful presence with light shining from behind him. The light was brighter than anything I've experienced here on earth, but it wasn't blinding. And there was the sweetest angel that comforted me and told me, 'Relax. Everything's going to be just fine,' and that I was going to have to go back," end of quote. So this happened 2 years ago. So he was 80 at the time. He's now 82. And he says that he feels that one of the reasons why he came back was that God sent him back to tell other people about his experience. So obviously he is somebody who has experienced what are called NDEs, a near-death experience. And I'm not exaggerating this. There have been millions of purported near-death experiences since CPR was invented in the year 1960. And so in this piece, an NYU intensive care physician by the name of Dr. Sam Parnia was also interviewed about this, because he's an author of a brand new study that talks about what he calls the hidden consciousness of death. Because what he did was he measured electrical activity in the brains of people who are sort of in the process of clinical death and being resuscitated by medical personnel. And he said this, quote, this is Dr. Sam Parnia said, "Many people report the same experience. Their consciousness becomes heightened and more vivid. Their thinking becomes sharper and clearer, all while doctors like myself are trying to revive them and think that they're dead," end of quote. He also said this, that these people who report these experiences, quote, "have a sensation that they have separated from the body, and they can see and hear doctors and nurses, and they were able to report what doctors were doing to them in a 360-degree way that's inexplicable to them," end of quote. So this is intriguing. People reporting specific things that are being done to them while they're on the table. That's not all. Another common experience of these NDEs, these near-death experiences, that people will often review their entire lives. It's almost like a "this is your life" type of experience, not a game show. This is far more serious than that. These people will review their entire lives, and they'll have these memories about things that happened in their life, thoughts, what they were thinking about, what they were feeling, different events that took place. And they'll recall things, and they'll experience things they'd kind of forgotten about in their walking around life. And then they will kind of evaluate their experiences based on moral and ethical principles. And this is what Dr. Parnia says. He says, quote, "It's a global comprehension of their behavior throughout life where they can no longer deceive themselves, end of quote. Now, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because Scripture is full of verses that talk about the fact that when we stand before Christ in the afterlife, everything we've ever done, everything we've left undone is going to be laid bare, and we have to give an account to Almighty God. And we're not going to be able to fudge out of this. We will know whether or not we were acting in accord with the truth. And we're not going to be able to deceive ourselves and certainly not deceive God. So there's no point in even trying. It's kind of interesting, this idea that in these near-death experiences, people are sort of having their life played out before them like a movie, and they know for sure, oh yeah, that thing that I did, inexcusable. There's no way I can justify that. They can no longer deceive themselves. But that's not all. That's not all. Dr. Parnia says that people also report seeing a God-like being. Seeing a God-like being. And he says this, quote, if you happen to be a Christian, you say, I saw Jesus. If you happen to be an atheist, you say, I saw this incredible being of love and compassion. All of this has been reported now for more than 60 years, end of quote. Okay, so these are common things that you hear about near-death experiences and what people are saying, what they're reporting. A lot of people talk about going towards a beautiful light, just like the guy that I mentioned off the top, Aubrey Osteen, who had this near-death experience when he was 80. So it's interesting that no matter what religious background the person is from, they're claiming that their near-death experience kind of validates what they believe. Here's the study. In the medical journal, Resuscitation, it talked about how trained teams in 25 different hospitals in the U.S., in the U.K., in the United Kingdom, and Bulgaria, what they did was they went into rooms where patients were what they call coding. Okay, that means they're sort of flatlining, they're technically dead. So the doctors are doing CPR, and then the researchers, what they did was they, without disturbing the work of the doctors, without affecting their ability to try to resuscitate the individual, they hooked up devices to the dying person's head and brain. How are they able to do this? How did they have enough time to do this? Well, that's because the resuscitation attempts would last for quite a few minutes, sometimes between 23, 26 minutes. Sometimes they would be performing CPR on a person for up to an hour, trying to get him back. So incredibly intense. Nobody ever tried to do anything like this before. But believe it or not, this was successful. They were able to actually successfully measure the person's brains and what was going on in their brains while they were trying to be brought back. So here's what Dr. Sam Parnia says from NYU. He says they would measure brain activity every 2 or 3 minutes. The doctors would have to stop doing their chest compressions, stop giving electric shocks with the paddles. They're trying to see if the patient's heart would start again. So he said there was, quote, there was no movement. It was a silence. That's when we would take measurements to see what's happening. We found that the brains of people who are going through death have flatlined, which is what you would expect. But interestingly, even up to an hour into the resuscitation, we saw spikes. The emergence of brain electrical activity. The same kind of activity as you would have when you're talking or deeply concentrating, end of quote. Now that's intriguing. That kind of jumps off the page there. What kinds of brain spikes were they seeing? With their equipment, they were seeing gamma spikes, delta, theta, alpha, beta waves. They had 567 people that were in the study, but only 10% of them, 53 people, were able to be brought back to life or resuscitated. Only 28 were interviewed. And unfortunately, only 11 patients said that they were aware of anything that was going on during CPR while they were being resuscitated. And only 6 people reported that they had a near-death experience. So probably not as many near-death experiences as they'd hoped for. But what they did was they sort of took their experiences and they compared them to other testimonies of people who had near-death experiences. 126 other survivors of cardiac arrest. They weren't part of the study, but they had a near-death experience. And what Dr. Sampar says was, quote, we were able to show very clearly that this recorded experience of death, this idea, this sense of separation, this review of your life from the beginning to the end, going to a place that feels like home and then a recognition that you need to come back that was constant across people from all over the world. End of quote. So this is pretty intriguing stuff. So similar experiences being reported, no matter where you're from, it's the same type of thing. And people might say, oh, hang on here. These near-death experiences, they're just the result of electrical impulses in the brain when you're under trauma. And it's the same thing as researchers can kind of poke different areas of your brain to provoke different responses or cause electrical impulses to be put on different areas of the brain, and they'll sort of get the result they're looking for. You can see a light or something like that. Not so fast. They took all the results of their studies and they compared them with studies on hallucinations, delusions, illusions, and it was totally different stuff. They were not the same kind of results at all. So Dr. Sampar says, we were able to conclude that the recalled experience of death is real. There's a brain marker that we've identified. These electrical signals are not being produced as a trick of a dying brain, which is what a lot of critics have said. End of quote. This entire episode of The Cale Clarke Show is available on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay. Download the app today, and thanks for listening.